I'm Congressman Bill Posey, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to learn more about the budget crisis facing our nation. I'll try to be brief, but need to go into some detail to adequately describe the situation. This presentation will last approximately 12 minutes. Given the importance of this crisis, I will trust that you will find it a worthwhile investment of your time. Our nation has been through a great deal in the past several years. We've seen the collapse of the housing market, our financial markets have suffered greatly, and the unemployment rate is higher than at any time since the Great Depression. Complicating matters, the administration's policies and their federal regulations have created a very adverse economic climate, making our nation's recovery all the more difficult. While each of these issues is cause for concern, the most critical is the unprecedented and unsustainable deficit spending in which Washington has indulged over the past 2 years. We are at a critical crossroads as a nation, and we have two options. The first option is to stick our head in the sand and ignore the problem. This will not stop the inevitable, and it will make it come sooner rather than later. Greece took this path, which led to dramatic cuts in their Social Security safety net, especially for those in retirement. None of us wants that to happen here, but if we fail to act now, we will end up where Greece did. There is an alternative. We can face reality and acknowledge that the day of reckoning is fast approaching. We can curb spending to protect America's future and avoid an economic disaster that will make our current financial troubles pale in comparison. Also, I believe we can do this and keep our nation's promise to those who are in or near retirement. Indeed, my promise to those currently in or who are near retirement is that they will see no changes whatsoever to Social Security or Medicare. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so let me share a few pictures that will illustrate the current crisis. In fiscal year 2010, federal spending was approximately $3.5 trillion. The President wants to increase spending to $3.7 trillion in 2012. As you can see from the chart, 63% of the federal budget is spent on automatic spending for mandatory programs like Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, and interest payments. Less than 40% of the budget is spent on what is considered discretionary spending, things like national defense, homeland security, transportation, and the alphabet soup of federal agencies. Here is another way of looking at those same figures. Mandatory spending is 63% of the budget, while discretionary spending is just 37% of the budget. So how do we pay for this? How much tax revenue is coming in? And how much is deficit spending? Looking at our chart, essentially all of the red is borrowed money, nearly 40% of the federal budget. Here you see in green that annual revenues, best known as federal taxes, amount to about $2.2 trillion per year. Also notice this green is more than consumed by the mandatory parts of the federal budget that you see in the second pie chart, these being Social Security, Medicare, interest, Medicaid, veterans benefits, etc. The red in the second chart shows you all the rest of the federal government's $1.2 trillion in spending. National defense, every federal agency and department, homeland security, transportation, energy, NASA, medical research, health and human services. Looking at these two charts, you can see that the blue mandatory spending is essentially equal to the entire revenue of the federal government. Federal taxes only covered 2/3 of our federal spending in 2010. And as you see, they will cover less than that in 2012 under the budget proposed by the administration. Here's another way of looking at that chart. The blue represents tax revenue and spending on mandatory programs. The red represents borrowing and deficit spending. Sometimes it's hard to get our arms around federal spending, so let's look at a family budget instead. Let's take a family earning $35,000 per year. If this family did what the federal government did, it would spend about $50,000, putting $15,000 on its credit card. Let's say the family does that for 3 years in a row. That brings the debt to over $45,000. What becomes the fastest growing part of the family budget? The first part is total debt. The second is growing interest payments from rolling the debt over to the next year, leaving less of the family budget for food, housing, and the necessities of life. A family can't run a budget that way. The bill will come due sooner or later. And you and I both know that every year you continue to add to that debt, the more likely it is that you will have to file bankruptcy. These same economic principles apply to the federal budget as well. While the family we talked about had only been accumulating debt for 3 years, our federal government has been at it for several generations with a strong uptick in 2008. At various times in our nation's history, the federal government has had cause to borrow money. While there was an end to the growth of debt after World War II, there is no end in sight for the latest debt load. In fact, the red ink will grow rapidly if we continue on the current path. What has caused the rapidly deteriorating fiscal picture? Spending in Washington. Current federal spending is unsustainable. If we do not do something now to rein in runaway deficit spending, the system will collapse. Under the administration's proposed budget, federal spending is up 50% over 2005 levels. Your paycheck hasn't risen 50% in the past 5 years, and you can't afford to pay for that much more government either. And the red ink continues to rise in 2020 and beyond. Let's go back to our family making $35,000 a year. If you put them on this same path, they would see their debt grow to nearly $200,000 over the next 10 years. That's simply a path to bankruptcy, if they even make it that far. You might be wondering, who owns our debt? Well, in 1970, 95% of the debt was owed to American citizens. Today, over 47% of our debt is owed to foreign countries. China holds the lion's share of our debt, and this threatens our independence and national sovereignty. If you want to give China more control over us, then keep adding more debt. You recall that this chart shows two major categories of spending for the $3.5 trillion federal budget. First, there is mandatory spending, accounting for more than 60% of the federal budget. These programs are like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, and other payments like veterans benefits. Second, there is discretionary spending, including defense spending, which is about 20% of the federal budget, and the alphabet soup of federal agencies: Transportation, State Department, Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and on and on. Let's break that down a little more. Can you see here, comparatively, that the various federal agencies amount to very narrow wedges of the overall budget pie? Since 2008, the administration and Congress increased non-defense discretionary spending by an unprecedented 24%. Certainly there is savings to be had there, but even if we totally eliminate every discretionary dollar, every federal agency, including the entire Department of Defense, we would still be unable to balance the federal budget. People often tell me, just eliminate foreign aid and you can balance the budget. While I believe there are billions of dollars in savings to be found there, the fact is foreign aid and earmarks combined consume only 2.11% of the budget. You still fall more than $1.5 trillion short of what is needed to balance the budget in 2012. So what is driving our increasing debt, and what can we do about it? Indeed, the impending retirement of the baby boomers will put further strain on the mandatory portion of the federal budget, Medicare in particular, and to a lesser extent, Social Security. Cuts in discretionary spending are an important first step, but failing to consider the long-term budget implications of Medicare and Medicaid in particular will threaten the viability of our nation and indeed the ability of Medicare to continue paying for services. Continued deficit spending will drive our interest payments so high that we can ill afford to do much more than pay the interest on the debt. Indeed, by failing to act, Washington will make it more difficult for Medicare and Social Security to pay beneficiaries in the future. Let's look at another chart that shows what will happen beginning this year. Social Security and Medicaid will experience some growth in the years ahead, but based on Congressional Budget Office projections, the greatest driver of increased spending will be Medicare. I believe that those in or near retirement should see no changes to their Social Security or their Medicare. But for those under the age of 50 to 55, some changes may be phased in. While we were on this topic of Medicare and Social Security, let me once again emphasize my commitment to America's seniors who have grown to rely on Social Security and Medicare. Let me reiterate, so that there is no question whatsoever about my commitment. My firm position is that those in or near retirement will see no changes to their Social Security or Medicare. The United States is in a threefold crisis. There is an economic crisis as we struggle with record unemployment at levels not seen since the Great Depression. There is a budget crisis as we spend more than we have and our borrowing threatens our future. Most importantly, there is a leadership crisis as the administration and Congress have failed to respond to the pressing need to cut spending. Tax increases sound like a solution to some, but they will not come close to solving the problem. The administration's policies have already placed a heavy burden on businesses, and higher taxes will strangle our fragile recovery. We must find our way back to sound fiscal policy that begins with spending restraint. For too long, Washington has felt it had all the answers. Well, there's a new crew in town now, and we know that the American people have much more common sense than the politicians in Washington have ever given them credit for. I welcome your feedback and ideas. I would like to know what your thoughts are on how you think we can best put our nation on a path to something other than bankruptcy. I look forward to hearing from you. Please hit the Contact Bill button on my website and share your ideas with me. Thank you again for your time, because I know it's valuable to you and your family. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.